Dr. Han Daiji stared at her equipment bag in complete shock. Two tiny black eyes peered back at her from between her carefully packed science tools. The small golden-brown hamster sat there, casually munching on a piece of her emergency protein bar. "Mr. Bubbles, how did you get in here?" she whispered, quickly closing her cabin door. The tiny hamster just twitched his whiskers at her, continuing to enjoy his stolen snack. This was bad. This was very, very bad. The Stellar Horizon had strict rules about unauthorized life forms on board. Even a tiny hamster could get her into huge trouble. Daiji ran her fingers through her short black hair, trying to think clearly. She had packed her bags 3 days ago for this 6-month research mission. Somehow, her clever little pet must have snuck into the bag while she wasn't looking. Mr. Bubbles had always been unusually smart for a hamster, but this was a whole new level of clever. The ship's gentle humming filled the silence as Daiji paced her small cabin. They were already 2 days into their journey to the outer colonies. There was no way to turn back now. "What am I going to do with you?" she asked, watching as Mr. Bubbles finished his snack and began exploring the edge of her bag. The hamster stopped and sat up on his hind legs, cleaning his face with his tiny paws as if he didn't have a care in the world. A knock at her door made her jump. "Dr. Han, are you ready for the morning briefing?" It was Dr. Kim Yubin, her fellow scientist. "Just a minute." Daiji quickly grabbed Mr. Bubbles, who didn't protest at all. It was strange how calm he was about being in space. Most animals got stressed during space travel, but Mr. Bubbles seemed perfectly happy. She looked around her cabin frantically. She needed a safe place to keep him. Her eyes landed on her spare storage container. It was meant for collecting samples, but it would have to do for now. She quickly punched air holes in the lid with her pen. "Sorry, Mr. Bubbles," she whispered, placing him inside with some spare cloth for bedding and pieces of her protein bar. "I'll make you a better home later." Opening her door, she found Yubin waiting patiently. Her colleague's kind face showed concern. "Are you okay? You look worried." "I'm fine," Daiji said too quickly. "Just had trouble finding my datapad." As they walked to the briefing room, Daiji's mind raced. She would need food for Mr. Bubbles, water, proper bedding. How was she going to get all that without anyone noticing? The briefing room was already full when they arrived. Captain Song stood at the front, discussing their research mission to study new life forms on Colony X-227. Daiji tried to focus, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her cabin. "Dr. Han." Captain Song's voice snapped her to attention. "You'll be leading the xenobiology team once we arrive. Any concerns?" Daiji straightened in her chair. "No, Captain. My team is ready." She ignored Yubin's curious glance. She was usually more attentive during briefings. After the meeting, Daiji hurried back to her cabin. When she opened the storage container, Mr. Bubbles was sitting exactly where she'd left him, looking up at her with those intelligent eyes. "You're going to get me in so much trouble," she told him, gently scratching behind his ears. The hamster leaned into her touch, perfectly relaxed. Looking at his calm, happy face, Daiji felt something strange. Like this wasn't just a random accident. Mr. Bubbles had always been different from other hamsters. He solved puzzles meant for much smarter animals. He never tried to escape his cage at home. He always seemed to know when she was sad and needed company. "Did you plan this?" she asked him quietly. Mr. Bubbles just blinked at her, his whiskers twitching. Daiji shook her head and laughed at herself. That was silly. He was just a hamster, even if he was a smart one. She had no idea that in a few days, this tiny stowaway would change everything. She reached for her datapad to start her daily log, then stopped. This would have to be her first secret in 10 years of scientific work. Looking at Mr. Bubbles again, she sighed. "You better be worth all this trouble, little guy." Mr. Bubbles just yawned and curled up in his makeshift bed, looking very pleased with himself. 3 days had passed since Daiji discovered Mr. Bubbles in her bag. She had managed to create a comfortable hidden home for him inside a broken sample analyzer. No one ever checked that corner of her cabin, and the machine's empty shell made a perfect house for a secret hamster. The ship's night cycle was just beginning when the first explosion rocked the stellar horizon. Daiji fell out of her bed, hitting the cold floor hard. Red emergency lights flooded her cabin. Warning: unknown vessels approaching. All crew to emergency stations. The ship's voice was calm, but Daiji's heart raced. She scrambled to her feet and looked at Mr. Bubbles' hiding place. The hamster was already awake, standing on his hind legs, nose twitching rapidly. A second explosion shook the ship. This time, Daiji heard screaming from the hallway. She grabbed her lab coat and reached for the door, then stopped. What about Mr. Bubbles? The hamster squeaked once, then disappeared deeper into his hiding spot, as if telling her not to worry about him. Daiji hesitated for just a second more, then ran into the hallway. Chaos greeted her. Crew members ran in every direction. Through the window at the end of the hall, she saw 3 black ships surrounding the stellar horizon. Each one had the same mark painted on its side: a broken skull with red eyes. Pirates. Everyone to the cargo bay. A rough voice boomed through the ship's speakers. Any resistance will result in hull breaches. We will space anyone who doesn't cooperate. Dr. Kim Yubin appeared beside Daiji, grabbing her arm. We have to go, she whispered. Captain Song already tried to fight back. They spaced his assistant to prove they were serious. Daiji felt sick. They had no choice. Together with the other crew members, they made their way to the cargo bay. The pirates stood at every corner, wearing black armor and carrying plasma rifles. Their helmets had the same red-eyed skull painted on them. In the cargo bay, Daiji counted at least 15 pirates, but their leader was impossible to miss. Captain Rock stood a full head taller than his crew, his armor decorated with strange marks that looked like kill counts. Unlike his men, he wore no helmet. His face was covered in scars, and his left eye glowed with a red cybernetic replacement. Well, Rock's voice was surprisingly soft, which somehow made him even scarier. The famous research vessel, Stellar Horizon. Your cargo and research will make us very rich indeed. Next to him stood his first mate, Lee Do-hyun. Unlike the others, Do-hyun's armor looked uncomfortable on him. He kept adjusting his helmet and breathing heavily. Daiji watched as he finally removed his helmet, revealing a face that looked human but wasn't quite right. His skin had a slight blue tint, and his eyes were too large. Search every cabin, Rock ordered. Find all their research data, and find their backup drives. I know these science types. They always have backups. Daiji's heart stopped. Mr. Bubbles was still in her cabin. If they found him. But she couldn't worry about that now. The pirates were forcing everyone to sit on the cold cargo bay floor. Do-hyun walked among them, scanning each person with a strange device. Captain, he called out, his voice wheezing slightly. Most of them are just scientists, but we have some security personnel mixed in. Should I separate them? No need, Rock smiled, and it was terrible to see. They won't try anything. Will you? He pulled out his plasma rifle and pointed it at the nearest crew member, a young engineer named Park Sun-mei. She closed her eyes, trembling. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Good, Rock lowered his weapon. We'll be borrowing your ship for a while. Stay quiet, stay still, and you might survive this. Cause trouble. He glanced at the airlock, and you won't need your spacesuits. In her cabin, unnoticed by everyone, Mr. Bubbles watched through a ventilation grate as pirates ransacked Daiji's room. His tiny black eyes followed their every movement. When they finally left, he squeezed through the grate into the ship's ventilation system. The smallest hero on the stellar horizon was about to begin his mission. The pirates had no idea what was coming. Mr. Bubbles moved silently through the ventilation system of the stellar horizon. His tiny paws made no sound on the metal as he explored his new domain. The hamster might have been small, but his mind was busy working. From his hiding spots behind the vents, he could see everything happening on the ship. In the cargo bay, the crew sat huddled together, watched by armed pirates. Mr. Bubbles spotted Daiji sitting next to Yubin, both looking worried but unhurt. The hamster continued his journey through the vents, stopping to watch the pirates at work. He noticed something interesting about Lee Do-hyun, the first mate. Every 30 minutes, the alien would remove his helmet and take deep breaths, as if he couldn't stand wearing it for too long. Mr. Bubbles stored this information in his clever little head and moved on. He found his way to the ship's kitchen, where two pirates were eating stolen food. They had left their helmets on a counter, complaining about the long hours of guard duty. Captain Rock wants us to guard these scientists for 3 whole days while he searches for their secret research, one pirate grumbled. 3 days in these uncomfortable suits. The other pirate laughed. Better than Do-hyun. Poor guy can barely breathe in his. Some alien he is. Can't even handle our air mixtures properly. Mr. Bubbles' whiskers twitched. This was useful information. He watched as the pirates finished eating and put their helmets back on, but not before he noticed something else interesting. Each helmet had a small air filter on the side. The hamster continued his exploration, creating a map in his mind. He found the engine room, where Park Sun-mi was being forced to keep the ship systems running. He discovered the bridge, where Captain Rock was trying to break into the ship's computers. Most importantly, he found all the places where the pirates had stored their spare equipment. When the ship's night cycle began again, Mr. Bubbles started his real work. He scurried to the kitchen first. The pirates had left their meal trays out. With careful little bites, he chewed small holes in the bottom of each disposable tray. Next time someone used them, their food would slowly spill out. Moving to the storage room, he found the pirates' spare helmet filters. It took him nearly an hour, but he managed to drag one down into the vents. He would need it later. Back in the vents above the cargo bay, Mr. Bubbles watched Do-hyun remove his helmet again. The alien first mate was breathing heavily, his blue-tinted face showing discomfort. Mr. Bubbles noticed how the other pirates kept their distance, as if worried about his condition. The hamster's next stop was the engine room. Park Sun-mi was alone, working on the engines while a single pirate guard dozed in the corner. Mr. Bubbles carefully pushed a small wrench off a high shelf. It fell with a clang, making the guard jump awake. "What was that?" the guard demanded. "Just a loose tool," Sun-mi said calmly, but her eyes darted to the ceiling. For a second, she thought she saw something small move in the vent above. Mr. Bubbles wasn't done yet. He made his way to the bridge, where Captain Rock was sleeping in the captain's chair. The hamster dropped down silently and scurried across the control panel. His tiny paws pressed several buttons in a specific order, something he had seen Daiji do when she worked late in her lab. The ship's lights flickered once, then returned to normal. No one noticed that deep in the ship's computer system, something had changed. Mr. Bubbles had just reactivated a small part of the ship's eye. As the hamster returned to the vents, he carried with him the small air filter he had collected earlier. He knew exactly where to put it, right in the ventilation shaft above where Do-hyun usually stood guard. Tomorrow, when the ship's temperature would naturally rise during its day cycle, that filter would start to degrade. And when it did, Do-hyun would have an even harder time breathing. Mr. Bubbles made his way back to check on Daiji one last time. She was sleeping fitfully on the cargo bay floor. He wanted to go to her, to let her know he was helping, but he knew he had to stay hidden. Instead, he continued his quiet work in the shadows. After all, he wasn't just any hamster. He was the hamster that was going to save the stellar horizon. The next morning cycle started with chaos in the pirate crew. Somehow, half their breakfast had ended up on the floor through mysterious holes in the bottom of their trays. Captain Rock was furious, but that was just the beginning. "Someone's been messing with our equipment," a pirate reported to Rock. "Found teeth marks on some of our wires. Must be rats on this science ship." Rock grabbed the damaged wire, studying it closely. Find these rats. I won't have vermin damaging our operation. In the ventilation system above, Mr. Bubbles watched with satisfaction. He had spent the whole night cycle working. His tiny teeth had carefully chewed through specific wires, not enough to cause major damage, but enough to make things stop working at just the right moment. Park Sun-mai, still forced to work in the engine room, noticed strange things happening. Tools that she needed would appear mysteriously on her workbench when the guard wasn't looking. Important wires that the pirates had disconnected would reconnect themselves. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Then she saw it, a tiny shadow moving in the vent above her head. Sun-mi kept quiet, but she began watching more carefully. Meanwhile, Do-hyun was having a terrible day. The ship felt hotter than usual, and his breathing was getting worse. Every time he took off his helmet near the cargo bay, he seemed to wheeze more. The other pirates started avoiding him even more. The temperature controls must be broken, Do-hyun complained to Rock. And something's wrong with my air filter. Fix it yourself, Rock snapped. We have bigger problems. The ship's AI is acting strange. Simple commands aren't working right. What Rock didn't know was that Mr. Bubbles had been very busy with the ship's computer system. The small part of the AI he had reactivated was now causing tiny problems throughout the ship. Doors would take an extra second to open. Lights would flicker in empty corridors. Nothing big enough to raise alarms, but enough to keep the pirates distracted. In the cargo bay, Daiji watched all of this with growing curiosity. As a scientist, she noticed patterns. The pirates were getting jumpier, making mistakes. Equipment failures were happening at surprisingly convenient moments. She leaned over to whisper to Yubin. Something weird is going on. These aren't random accidents. Yubin nodded slightly. The guard rotation is getting messy. They're spending more time fixing problems than watching us. They weren't the only ones who noticed. Choi Ta-won, the ship's security officer, had been quietly observing everything. He saw how the pirates' perfect operation was slowly falling apart. Mr. Bubbles continued his work. He found the pirates' communication devices and chewed through just enough wires to make them crackle with static. He dropped small nuts and bolts in their path, making them slip at key moments. Best of all, he figured out how to trigger small power fluctuations by touching specific wires together. But his masterpiece was what he did to Do-hyun's spare helmets. The hamster had spent an hour carefully chewing tiny holes in the air filters. Not big enough to notice, but big enough to make the alien first mate feel worse and worse. Sun-mai, still watching the vents carefully, finally caught a clear glimpse of their mysterious helper. Her eyes widened as she saw the small golden-brown hamster dragging a piece of wire through the vent. She almost gasped, but caught herself just in time. A hamster. All of this was being done by a hamster. It seemed impossible, but she had seen it with her own eyes. The ship's day cycle was getting hotter, just as Mr. Bubbles had planned. Soon, Do-hyun would need to take his helmet off again. When he did, he would breathe in the specially prepared air near his usual spot, air that the clever hamster had carefully contaminated with particles from the degraded filter. Everything was ready for the next phase of Mr. Bubbles' plan. The pirates thought they were dealing with simple equipment failures and rats. They had no idea that every problem, every malfunction, every little accident was part of a carefully planned strategy. And the best part was still to come. The ship's temperature kept rising. Do-hyun pulled off his helmet, gasping for air. His face had turned a darker shade of blue, and his breathing was worse than ever. The other pirates watched nervously as their first mate struggled. "Captain," Do-hyun called out, his voice raspy. "Something's wrong with the air system." In the vents above, Mr. Bubbles watched carefully. The damaged air filter he had planted was working perfectly. Now it was time for the next step. The hamster scurried through the ventilation system to the engine room. Sun-mai was there, pretending to work on repairs while actually watching the vents. When she saw the small shadow appear, she quickly looked away. making sure the guard didn't notice anything strange. Mr. Bubbles dropped down silently behind a large pipe. His tiny paws worked quickly, connecting two specific wires he had prepared earlier. Sparks flew, and suddenly the ship's lights went completely dark. Emergency lights came on, casting everything in a dim red glow. The pirates started shouting in confusion. That's when Mr. Bubbles triggered his next surprise. The ship's air vents burst open, releasing the contaminated air he had carefully collected. Do-hyun, already struggling to breathe, fell to his knees. Other pirates rushed to help him, taking off their own helmets in the confusion. Everyone, helmets on. Rock shouted, but it was too late. The contaminated air was spreading through the cargo bay. Foy Ta-won, the security officer, saw their chance. Now, he yelled, jumping to his feet. The crew members who could fight sprang into action, catching the distracted pirates off guard. Sunmai slammed her wrench into her guard's helmet, cracking its visor. In the chaos, she ran to the engine control panel and started pressing buttons rapidly. The Hamster had shown her exactly which systems were ready to be reactivated. Daji and Yubin helped other crew members overpower the pirates who were coughing and struggling to breathe. The contaminated air didn't affect humans the same way it affected Do-hyun's alien biology, but it made the pirates' eyes water and their throats burn. Lock down the bridge. Rock's voice boomed over the confusion. He was trying to seal himself away from the chaos, but Mr. Bubbles had prepared for this too. The bridge doors wouldn't close properly. The Hamster's careful sabotage had made sure of that. Rock's cybernetic eye glowed red with anger as he realized he was trapped with his rebelling prisoners. "Stop them, you fools!" Rock shouted at his crew, but most of them were too busy dealing with their own breathing problems. Do-hyun lay unconscious on the floor, his blue skin now almost gray. Mr. Bubbles wasn't done yet. He reached the main computer console and made his final move. His tiny paws pressed the last sequence of buttons he had memorized from watching Daji work. Suddenly, the ship's AI came fully back online. Security protocols reactivated. The calm computer voice announced, "Unauthorized personnel detected. Initiating containment procedures." The cargo bay doors slid shut, trapping several pirates inside. Others found themselves locked in corridors and storage rooms. The crew members who had been fighting quickly gained the upper hand. Rock roared in fury, pulling out his plasma rifle. "I'll space every last one of you," he threatened, aiming at the nearest crew member. That's when Mr. Bubbles made his most daring move. He dropped down from the vent right onto Rock's cybernetic eye. The pirate captain screamed in surprise, his shot going wide and hitting the ceiling. Ta-won didn't waste the opportunity. He tackled Rock, and with the help of two other crew members, they finally subdued the pirate captain. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The pirates were captured, locked in secure rooms by the ship's eye. The crew was free, treating their minor injuries and securing the ship. "What just happened?" Yubin asked, looking around in amazement. How did everything go wrong for them so perfectly? Sunmi smiled, looking up at the ventilation shaft. "We had help," she said. "The smallest hero I've ever seen." The hours after the crew's victory were busy ones. Security Officer Ta-won and his team had locked all the pirates in the brig, while Park Sunmi worked to fix the ship's damaged systems. Dr. Kim Yoo-bin treated the injured crew members in the medical bay. But Daeji was worried. She hadn't seen Mr. Bubbles since before the pirates attacked. As soon as she could, she rushed back to her cabin. The broken sample analyzer where she had hidden him was empty. "Mr. Bubbles," she called softly, her heart racing. "Where are you?" "Dr. Han." Sunmi's voice came from the doorway. Daeji turned around quickly, trying to hide her worry. The engineer stood there with an unusual smile on her face. "I think I know what you're looking for," Sunmi said. "Or should I say, who you're looking for? A small furry hero, perhaps." Daeji's eyes went wide. "You know about Mr. Bubbles?" "Know about him," Sun Mi laughed. I watched him save our ship. Come with me. There's something you need to see. They walked to the engine room, where Sun Mi had set up several screens showing security camera footage. Watch this, she said, pressing play. Daiji gasped as she watched the recordings. There was Mr. Bubbles, moving through the ship like a tiny special agent. She saw him chewing through wires, dropping tools where Sun Mi could find them, and even working the computer controls. He's been helping me fix the ship's systems, Sun Mi explained. I've never seen anything like it. He understands how everything works. Just then, they heard a familiar squeak. Mr. Bubbles appeared from a vent, climbing down to the control panel. He sat up on his hind legs and looked at them, whiskers twitching. There you are. Daiji reached for him, but stopped when she saw what he was doing. Mr. Bubbles turned to the control panel and started pressing buttons in a specific pattern. The main screen lit up with a message. AI core ricovieri, 85% complete. He's been helping me rebuild the ship's eye, Sun Mi said with amazement. Somehow, he remembered the reboot sequences from watching you work. He started the recovery process during the fight. Daiji picked up Mr. Bubbles gently. Is this true? Have you been our secret hero all along? The hamster squeaked and snuggled into her hands, looking very pleased with himself. We should tell the others, Sun Mi suggested. They need to know who really saved us. But before they could leave, the ship's partly recovered AI spoke up. Unusual intelligence detected, it said. Subject: small mammal, species Mesocracetus auratus. Capability level: unprecedented. Sun Mi rushed to the console. The AI is analyzing him. Look at these readings. The screen filled with data. Mr. Bubbles watched with interest as his brain activity patterns appeared on the display. They were like nothing anyone had ever seen before. This is amazing, Daiji whispered. All this time, I knew he was smart, but this is beyond anything in our research. The AI continued its analysis. Subject shows problem-solving abilities exceeding known parameters for species. Recommendation: update security protocols to recognize subject as crew member. Mr. Bubbles squeaked happily at this, making both women laugh. Wait until Yu-Bin sees this, Daiji said. Her research on enhanced animal intelligence was right all along. Sometimes evolution takes unexpected jumps. And sometimes, Sun Mi added, watching Mr. Bubbles explore the newly repaired control panel, heroes come in the smallest packages. The hamster turned to look at them, his black eyes bright with intelligence. He had more work to do. The ship's systems still needed fixing, and he had some ideas about improving their security against future pirate attacks. After all, he wasn't just a pet anymore. He was officially part of the crew, and Mr. Bubbles took his new job very seriously indeed. 1 week after capturing Captain Rock, the Stellar Horizon waited in deep space for the Space Authority ships to arrive. The pirate crews from the other ships had surrendered quickly after seeing their leader trapped in a specimen pod. Now, Officer Ba Jinho of the Space Authority stood in the ship's main conference room, reviewing the security footage for the third time. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Jinho said slowly. Your ship was saved by a hamster. Mr. Bubbles, Daiji corrected him politely. The hamster in question sat on the conference table, wearing a tiny magnetic belt that kept him from floating in the ship's low gravity. The crew had made it specially for him. Jinho watched the footage again. Mr. Bubbles appeared on screen after screen, sabotaging the pirates' equipment, helping the crew, and finally trapping Rock in the containment pod. This is the most unusual case I've ever seen, Jinho admitted. But the evidence is clear. Without this hamster's actions, the pirates would have stolen your research and probably killed your crew. Mr. Bubbles squeaked modestly and ate a small piece of carrot that Yu-Bin had given him. After all the excitement, he was enjoying being able to eat his snacks in public. The question is, Jinho continued, what do we do about this? There's no protocol for giving medals to hamsters. Actually, Sun Mai spoke up from her seat. We have a suggestion about that. She pressed a button, and the ship's AI displayed a new set of documents on the main screen. We've been studying Mr. Bubbles' brain patterns, Yubin explained. He's not just smart. He represents a completely new kind of intelligence. We think there might be more animals like him out there, waiting to be discovered. Daiji stood up and walked to the screen. We're proposing a new research program. Instead of banning animals from research vessels, we want to start bringing specially tested ones aboard. Mr. Bubbles has proved that they can be more than pets. They can be crew members. Jinho looked thoughtful. You want to change Space Authority regulations based on one hamster. One hamster who outsmarted the most dangerous pirate crew in 3 sectors, Todd One pointed out. Imagine what we might learn if we started looking for others like him. Mr. Bubbles walked across the conference table to the computer terminal. Everyone watched as his tiny paws pressed keys in a familiar pattern. Words appeared on the screen. Space Authority Regulation Aim and Demand. Section 12. Support animals in space. He wrote this himself, Sun Mai said proudly. He's been helping us draft the new regulations. They include safety protocols, testing procedures, everything we need to make this work. Jinho shook his head in amazement. A hamster who understands space regulations. Now I've seen everything. He smiled and pulled out his official tablet. I'll submit this to headquarters right away. I have a feeling they're going to be very interested. Later that day, the crew gathered in the recreation room for a celebration. Mr. Bubbles sat in a place of honor on a small platform they had built for him, complete with a tiny water bottle and his favorite treats. To the smallest hero in space, Ta One raised his cup in a toast. Everyone cheered, including the ship's eye, which had learned to make happy beeping sounds for special occasions. Daiji watched as Mr. Bubbles enjoyed his celebration. The hamster had changed everything, not just for their ship, but for the future of space exploration. Already, other research vessels were asking to join their new program. You know, Yubin said quietly to Daiji, some people still don't believe our reports about what happened here. Let them doubt, Daiji replied, smiling as Mr. Bubbles climbed onto her shoulder. We know the truth. Sometimes the biggest heroes come in the smallest packages. Mr. Bubbles squeaked in agreement. After all, he had work to do tomorrow. Being the first officially recognized hamster crew member in space was a big responsibility. But for now, he was content to enjoy his party and the gentle hum of the ship he had helped save. In the brig below, Captain Rock sat in his cell, still wondering how he had been defeated by a hamster. But that's a story he would never live down, especially since Mr. Bubbles had made sure all the security footage was safely backed up. Some say that to this day, space pirates tell stories about the golden brown hamster who brought down their greatest captain. And in the years that followed, every research vessel made sure to have at least one small furry crew member aboard, just in case.